All right, and we should be live. This is the first time I've done this live. It's the first time we've done the interview segments for the show, broadcasting on YouTube, Odyssey, X, and Rumble. So if anything goes wrong, it is my fault, but it's not my responsibility. And I just want to thank my esteemed guest, American Elitist, for joining me today. I've been on American Elitist show before. This would have been a few months ago. I had a fantastic time, and I really wanted to get you on our show so we can kind of continue our discussion, because I recall we had some other things to discuss. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to show up here.
No, it was my pleasure, man. You guys are really cool guys, and you're funny and based, and like that's pretty much the criterion for me to spend my time with people these days.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. And now we were just talking before the show, and you had just gotten back from the Old Glory Club conference, which is a event that a number of my friends went to. And I thought we could start with that, because maybe that will tee up what we're going to talk about. Because I've known a few people who went to that. Maybe they were feeling a bit down and feel a bit uninvigorated, and they came back feeling invigorated, feeling like they had a new direction for their politics at the very least. So I was wondering if you could. I've never been, so let me know, what's it like. You walk in, day one is Dave the Distributor sucking and fucking. What are we talking about here?
Okay, so day one is not that cool. But so day one is you get there, either you fly there or you drive there. So the first time you get there, you're probably pretty exhausted. However, by the time you get to the hotel where it takes place at, everybody's kind of gathered around the parking lot waiting for other people to arrive. So the first thing you do is you just like meet people, you exchange, telegrams, discords. Oh, you're that guy. Oh, you're Charlemagne. It's good to meet you, man. You connect people's voice to their face, IRL. And that's a very interesting process because your brain likes to play tricks on you. And sometimes the voice that you hear does not match the face you imagine that person to have. And that was the case for quite a bit of people at the US event this
Let me
year.
ask you this. What's Charlemagne wearing? What's he showing up? You see Charlemagne coming down the block.
He
Visually, how would...
He's wearing like a tan suit and like brown dress shoes, pretty much.
I'm always trying to get a feel for the suit situation on the ground at these conferences, because I had a few guys, people talk about what to wear and things in our space, and people like wearing suits. They get all suited and booted, but I'm seeing a lot of black suits. I think black is sometimes inappropriate for these events. So are you seeing a lot? And I'm always reminded of, I don't know if you know that guy, Review Bra. Who doesn't love Review Bra? Who doesn't love fast food reviews? But he always had a vibe of, he was wearing a suit that's always like 2 sizes too big and giving off a real sort of Tim Burton-ish vibe. Did you see a lot of that, or are we in a new era right now?
I'm not gonna lie, there was definitely some of that at the event this year. However, there was a lot of variety as well that surprised me. So you had a lot of people wearing beige suits, tan suits, white suits, gray suits, and me personally, I wore a blue suit actually as my main dress up for the big
That's
day, which
smart.
was Saturday.
It's dangerous because that's a bold color. And to me, just from my experience, it seems like only veterans are allowed to wear that. Like the only 2 types of people who can wear a blue suit usually, and that's like retired SEAL Team 6 guys or current pro wrestlers. So I'm, salutations for pulling that off.
Yes, I think it did look well on me. I also did get a nice extra dress coat. Just have something extra for the event because I was told not to wear the same thing for 3 days in a row. Trying to beat that like Anglo impulse to like not put an effort to your appearance in the modern day. But no,
Yeah,
dress codes are strictly enforced here. The discipline on the men is enforced.
yeah, I know. The older I get, I really am the guy who finds one type of shirt that he likes and just gets 7 of those shirts. Like, oh, one for every day. Not one extra. I can wear this shirt every day until they rot off my fucking body. Because it sounds like I'm being too critical of people. You gotta understand, I dress like an official retard. I'm acting out of pocket every which way, every single day. So I don't want it to sound like I'm high and mighty here and getting down on people. Because, one of these days I'd love to go to the Old Glory Club and I don't want to walk into a wall of fists. I don't want Charlemagne to come up to me and fucking scissor kick me back to Canada.
He might if you dress up too much like a retard. He might.
Damn it. But yeah, so I know some my friend Prudentialist and a couple others gave talks. What can you expect at an event like this? What were the talks like, or was there a theme?
So the theme for this year was taking the reins. And let me explain what that means for those who don't get the reference. Obviously, when you're riding a horse, the reins dictate the direction you want the horse to go into, not the speed of the horse. You usually kick the horse on its side to tell it to go faster. However, like if you just rely on using your feet, the horse is going to go wherever its way it wants, and it's going to be chaotic and not controlled. So you want to have reins on this machine. And that was kind of the main background to all of the speeches that were presented over the 3 days of the event. And what that entails is basically you got to take responsibility and action if we want to be a serious movement here. The time for play and Donald Trump memes and 4chan posting is kind of over. It's time to get serious. It's time to have some real risk on the line here. To do these things. And not to say that there isn't rewards for it. It's just to say there are consequences for doing this. And you should be well aware of that. And if you want to take action, then you're the kind of person we need here.
It's interesting you say that because I had recorded a live stream with the Prudentialist seemingly like the hours before he was out the door to go give his talk. And it was actually on this topic. And it was about how and that is up now. People can go to his Substack. There's like the first hour's free, full episode. We go for like 2 hours and 45 minutes. Rest of that's behind the paywall. But the topic was he called the consultancy crisis, which is a pretty cool term. But it was about how he works in government. He works in some capacity where he can allocate capital to fund projects. And his position was we should get more of our guys into these, not necessarily leadership political positions, but in these into the managerial state. We talk about the managerial state all the time. We're always talking about James Burnham in that capacity. But he's like, well, and this is the whole Project 2025 thing, which is like, can we actually just get our best psychos into the organs of power, and they won't be big, sexy, public-facing positions, but maybe you can get your hand on the spigot in some, and not even in DC or New York City, but some other town, and just start building that way. And I got some, and the entire argument was positioned that this isn't something everyone needs to do. You can still have people trying to get into politics. You can still have people preparing for the collapse over here. The whole idea was, if you want to do those things, you're probably already doing them. So you don't need to stop doing them. But there is this whole free floating mass of people who maybe aren't skilled enough to do those things, but need something to do. So, and they're, white collar guys, maybe. So here's a way to apply yourself along with these other strategies that people in our spaces are doing. So I got some pushback from that because I think people misinterpret it as, because every time you have an idea or a strategy, people think, oh, so that's the one strategy we all have to do. And that's not the case at all. But anyway, I'm just adding a whole fucking disclaimer to my last stream.
No, that is the thing about the dissident right, whatever you want to call this thing, anti-progressivism, whatever, words you would like to use, you can pick your choice. One of the guys had a very great saying about us. It's like, the dissident right is full of different factions and interesting ideas, and yet it does not believe in discourse of ideas as a mainstream principle of power. If you know what I mean there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And also, I know Charles Haywood, who we've had on the show before, is a good friend. He was advocating for netter, or no enemies to the right, or no enemies on the right, is one he's saying recently. And it's funny that I was watching this Shannon Sharp. I watch a lot of black entertainment from time to time. And so he's got a talk show, and there's all kinds of black comedians on there. And they were lamenting how black comedians, or like with Drake and Kendrick Lamar, it's like, we do our beefs in public. The white people don't do that. The white people, like Joe Rogan, help each other out and go on each other's podcasts. And that's true to an extent, but I kind of like the beefs. I like the arguments. I like big, messy debates. And I think, because there's been some flare ups over the years. I think, one big one not long ago was like Morgoth versus like a few people. Because who doesn't like Morgoth, right? But it was over COVID. And whenever like a content creator argues with another one, people are like, shush, don't, no, this is bad. This is bad for all of us. It's like, okay, we're grown ups. We're allowed to disagree. We're allowed to call each other names, even, because this is the internet. This is all kind of fake. I thought we understood that we're allowed to be a bit more hostile to each other because we're men on the right. We can be a bit crude and not take it so fucking personally and get so scared about it. That was my perspective anyway. So to me, I think part of our discourse is we should allow ourselves to be a bit more hostile to each other and not take it personally, because that they don't do that over on the left, and it's really gay and annoying and boring. And at a certain point, certain things need to be lines in the sand, I think. And everyone's got there's certain divisions that I think are always going to be there, and shit's going to happen. But what are you going to do about it? Not like cower. Anyway, what do you think about that?
No, I think you have a good point there. There does need to be this kind of like, checkmating of other people in the sphere, and disagreements and scuffles are a good thing actually, because it sharpens your ideas, right, of the person who's being attacked, right? If they have good ideas, their ideas will withstand the attack, right, and be proven correct over time, right? And if not, like, well, sorry, man, you got to deal with, the shit slinging storm of the internet here. This isn't like leftist Chan, YouTube, where we're gonna have a safe space for you and your pronouns as long as you're into luxury gay space communism.
Yeah, and I have to be told that more than anyone, because I do have the tendency to, like, someone says something mean to me, their name goes right into a notebook, and I gotta learn to burn that notebook. I gotta learn to stop making death notes for people who spurn me online. So, hey, again, dress like a retard, keep serial killer notebooks. I'm as guilty as anyone for all the things I'm criticizing. So that's where I'm coming from. But that's how I know.
No, that's all right. Listen, I think we all have our like quirks. Like, listen, we're all kind of insane. Like, if you're on the right, like you're kind of insane to a degree, right? If you're not just like one of these normies who wants to chug along to get along, right? So you'd have to have some inherent disagreeability about the system within you, and that means there's going to be some quirks there, and there's going to be some insanity, and there's going to be some cringe, but it's so worth it. Because you just have these such high quality people on our side. Not all of them. Some of them are spurgs who are useless, but you just have that quality on our side that you can never find on the other side, the left, which is just the mainstream, like goy slop, the gray ooze type of thing. It's unoriginal, bland. And on the right, you have like Papa John's, meat lovers special with a cookie pizza on the side, and it's like there's going to be some disagreements here about what's best, but at the end of the day, one's going to be better than the other at the end of the day.
I tell you what, it's always a knife fight over here on stuffed crust nationalism, but that's the way it should be. And I think that's what's interesting, is that there's more and more people migrating to our it's kind of weird to spatialize this, like the way I'm saying it, but there's more people who are taking to our ideas, especially women, just because, what was formerly like the dirtbag left, like that was the cool, edgy leftist. They're allowed to say slurs now and again, and they're allowed to laugh at heterodox things. But even people like they aged out of that. That's not cool anymore. They got lame. We're watching Brianna Wu, of all people, socialist Democrat, is on trigonometry right now saying the woke came for me too. I'm not doing an impression of Brianna Wu because this is what he sounds like. It's an insane man in a dress, like a Bernie bro, Gamergate veteran who's like, though the woke's gone too far, and so they're coming over here because all their ideas are dog shit. like Californians fleeing to Texas. And I think there's a lot of people who are greeting them with open arms. And I'm not thrilled about that. We don't actually need that many friends. We're allowed, like I think we've been proven cool by how lame they've been. And the worst thing that we can do is to like accept them and let them dictate what's acceptable over here now.
And that is the thing. You're correct about this like subculture of the right. Is like the right has basically had like the teeth kicked in for like 100 plus years at this point. It's just been beaten to death with like a whip, essentially, in the middle of a cornfield, if you would like to use a crude metaphor. And it's just used to be taking abuse and abuse and abuse from its estranged husband, and like basically it can't leave that relationship. And like if somebody just comes along and just says, well, I could beat you a little bit less, but like you got to change some of your ideas here, we're still going to keep things fundamentally the same, but we're just going to quirk it so that if the revolution stops where I want it to be, essentially. And that's the problem with the right. It's way too welcoming of people who say even the most modicum of disagreement with the simulacrum, right? And the greatest example of this I could think of is like what was that, like black bimbo whore who like everybody on the right was obsessed with during like the COVID thing, right? And she said like the vaccine was going way too far, and that was the one thing she said. I think it was Madonna or something like that. One of these like people, and all the people on the right were suddenly like, "Well, we love Madonna now. She's one of us," and it's just like, you morons. You're being played here, essentially.
Yeah, well, the COVID narrative is actually a great the COVID narrative is actually a great example of that. Sorry, I just muted you by accident.
No, go ahead.
Because like we started seeing a lot of liberals start to try and take those what they previously called conspiracy points and adopt them as their own. And you'll say like, well, we actually never liked the COVID vaccine. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like that was a weird thing, and you need to be a bit of a psycho to still keep hammering away at that. But that I am that type of psycho where I'm going to keep bringing it up. People think it's weird to still talk about COVID. It didn't happen that long ago. It was a big weird thing that happened, and there's a lot of people who kind of want to move on. So that was almost like a test case to be like, are you really going to grab a hold of this thing and ride it all the way to the bottom? But anyway, I wanted to get back to the Old Glory Club conference. I was wondering if you could summarize just what were some of the big takeaways for you, what you had learned at that conference from the perspective of let's also set this up from the perspective of a Zoomer. Would you say that the attendance was kind of young, and what spoke to you as a young man?
So, from my perspective, the audience who came, it was definitely quite a bit of Zoomers. There was also based Gen Xers and Millennials there too. These are your Daves, your Last Things, Prudentialists, some of these people. But you had a good mix of Zoomers in there. I would say maybe like 40%, 30% in total of everybody who attended. We had around 140-ish people who came to this conference. And as to what spoke to me the most, I think it was just the raw energy of these young men who are just like, no, we're done with this system. We're going to burn it to the ground. We are going to outlast it. We're going to build something to replace it. We are going to build the institutions of the future and become the new counter elite. And it's just this energy, raw energy, right? Of like, listen, we're going to win this fight. We're going to fight. You know what I mean? Like our lives are on the line here. Our culture's on the line here. And it's that like fire breathing spirit of really men with like fire in their chest. That's what really spoke to me, I think.
Yeah, I was reading an article in J'accuse not long ago. Whoever wrote it escapes me, but I covered it on one of the episodes of Real Secret Coffee Hours, which is our paywall show. But it was, you need to believe in the inevitability of your own ideas. And there's a few people who talk like that. Not a lot of people talk like that. A lot of people are very morose about the practicality of their own worldview. But there are a few who believe, even if they don't fully believe it, but they praxeologically believe in the inevitability of their own, not even a utopia, but their values. I think that's what separates our side from a lot of leftists. That I do think there's two animating forces behind this very big bucket of the left. One is a sort of naive utopianism, and another is just outright hatred for specific groups, and that need not even be, white people or certain ethnicities, but it could also be, the rich or landlords. A lot of it, and that's actually a pretty good way to organize and animate people to tear something down or kill someone. It works effectively well. It's kind of hard to sell people on the collectivism of ideals. And that's something we've kind of been beating our head at for, most of my life and experience in this space. But I think we're doing a better job of it by believing in the inevitability of it, and then actually picking targets that are opponents to those values, rather than thinking that, oh, our values are eternal, so we can just kind of wait it out. It's like, no, no, no. The vitality of your ideas and worldview are eternal, but they do have opponents and enemies that you need to take down or neutralize in some way. I think there's a lot of people who are thinking more practically right now, and I like that. That's what me and Prudentialist we're talking about, which is that you don't need one grand strategy that addresses everything, but as an individual or a crew, let's say it's you and five guys, which is the ideal organization for this. Like you can pick a reasonable goal, and you can execute that goal. Whereas I think you know, year like 7 years ago around there, it was way more common for, you enter the space, you're a young guy and you believe in certain heterodox things, or, you've been cast out of polite society for whatever reason. You're trying to join an army. There's a lot of guys, and I would argue that America First is a lot like this too. A lot of the guys involved in that, like, I want to join this big movement. And I think there's a move away from that. I think there's a move away from, like, I'm looking for an army to join. I'm looking for a leader or a dictator. There's been enough cults of personality that I'm not sure that that's going to excite people anymore, or it's not going to excite the people who know better. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're correct, and that was actually a big thing that we discussed during the event was these certain leaders of the ghost of alt right 1.0 and kind of their mistakes and follies, which cost them everything essentially, right? And obviously, the Grapers are one of those factions essentially. And what you have here with these people is just like, now they originally probably did have good intentions. They recognized society was firmly against them, and they were radicalized by Gamergate. So they understood, like, listen, our favorite media is being destroyed by women and SJWs and feminism. And if we don't do something about that, we're just gonna have like the gray goo video games forever. That's forever mediocre and gay. And that was the greatest thing to radicalize young people, and I'll explain why. It's not because Sargon is base, it's not because Gamergate, exposing Anita Sarkeesian was such an epic win, even though it was. It's because you pulled the wool off the young man's eyes, right? Because that's what video games did, right? They kept you in the matrix in a sense, right? You had this endless distraction, which provided you with fake brotherhood, fake sense of achievement, and doing something with your time, right? That included this concept of friends. You know what I mean? People used to meet in lobbies in video games, right? And those are the three things men need to thrive in society. Those three things: brotherhood, commitment, and like a sense of achievement, right? And once you took that away, they became angry and vitriolic. And they wanted to attack the person who did this to them because they realized, oh wow, the world is not what it seems. The land beyond the curtain is not what I was told it was going to be. And these people filtered into these guys who told them what they wanted to hear.
You know what? You mentioned something very interesting there, which is, you were sort of defining your meeting place as online. Like we used to meet in game lobbies and things like that, which is a very distinctly Zoomer thing to do. That started with my generation, but with millennials, and it seems silly to demarcate the generation like that because we actually have a lot in common. But online wasn't the primary place where people met. And I know we covered a couple books, Republic and Emancipation of Authorship, which is exploring the sort of fifth wave technological revolution that made online spaces and online identities the primary place where people would meet, and how that has granted them certain powers to attack authority that you might not have had before, if even if you were meeting in salons, even if you were because there's always intellectual movements, right? There's always sort of decentralized, you know, thought leaders, and they would communicate, and there's a whole network theory behind that. But one thing that, people would think that the internet revolution empowered the individual. It didn't really. It empowered communities and identities. So it's this goes kind of deep, but there's this idea of the people and then also the public. So the people were always abstracted. There's no real such thing as the people. And this is where I think Marxists get caught up. But there was always the public sphere. Jürgen Habermas talked about this in his book about the transformation of the public sphere, which is basically about the formation of the bourgeoisie as sort of the educated class. So you had the sort of population, then you had this like stratosphere above it. They were still the people. They weren't aristocrats. They weren't princes, but they might be, slightly wealthier, but more educated and more interested in philosophy and these ideas. So they had sort of aristocratic interests, but they didn't really have power, not compared to the center of power, not compared to the landed gentry or whoever it might be. So what you actually saw in history, this was a very, you know very fragmented thing. But if anything, with the information revolution, we propagated more publics. So there's still the people as this sort of non-entity, but that mass can articulate itself way more with way more smaller public domains, and make these sorts of communities that can weaponize themselves against the power structure in more interesting ways. And that's the world that a lot of Zoomers came up in, that they are completely acclimated to that, whereas Gen X kind of got into it later. A lot of them would have gotten into the early internet in their 30s and 40s. Millennials like myself would have been when we were teenagers. Zoomers are raised up in that sort of environment. So there's almost no correlation between any of that and the real world. By the real world, I mean, clubs and if anything, our space is kind of trying to recapture that by getting people offline and into more like active clubs, manor buns, whatever they call it, just getting out of church groups, get offline and reformulate these sorts of relationships. And that's a very long-winded, not even a question, more of a comment, really. But I'm wondering what you think about that, and if that sounds true to you.
No, it does sound true to me, especially the way you talked about how the internet was able to be used to organize peoples, right? And different disparate tribes of people. So the group I can think of as a prominent example is incels, or people who can't get laid, to be more crass, right? And these are just young men who essentially have kind of realized that like there's nothing in it for the system, in it for them. The system hates them. They're the wrong skin color to receive sympathy from the progressive apparatus. And the only way they could possibly get sympathy or Gibbs is if they troons themselves, essentially. So it's like total submission, total castration to receive, your pittance for, some total submission, right? And they were kind of like, most of them were kind of like, well, I don't want to do that. So the alternative was to follow these desperate, charismatic thought leaders that kind of started with alt-right 1.0, like the very beginning of the Trump era in like 2015, 2016, people like Richard Spencer, James Alsop, Nick Fuentes, Vincent James. There's a couple others in there as well, TRS guys, Mike Enoch. These people, right? And essentially what they captured was essentially what Andrew Tate built his brand off of, right? It's these young, broke men who have no prospects in life and are addicted to prawn and don't want to change themselves. And so they're just angry young men who have nothing going for themselves. And well, you have to preoccupy your time with something. It ain't going to be video games, as we just discussed before, because the video games are gay and retarded now. So it's going to be abstract political baseness, right? And what do I mean by abstract political baseness? I mean things like people who convert to Islam because of Muhammad beating women with a whip, right? Things like this, right? Abstract reasons which sound based and rad pill to them, right? But are actually attacking their native culture and hierarchy and subverting them. However, they don't really care. They're not really bought into the system, right? Because they're so moved to the fringe, right? So that's basically an open. It's basically like an open taxi you could just take over if you wanted to, if you had the will and capital to do it, right? And that's essentially what these people built their audiences off of.
Yeah, that's true. And if you look at that human capital, which is aggrieved young men, people are very concerned about where they're going, what they're doing, because they are agents of change. Especially if they're white guys, they're the ones who are troublemakers usually, especially to the state, and those tend to populate our spaces pretty heavily. Not as much as you might think, but I would say the majority still. Um, but I do wonder if there's two things you can do with that group. One, you're not supposed to say, but the one that, even the Andrew Tates like to do is corral them into a plantation where you just kind of feed them content and take their money and offer them courses and things like that. It seems that that is always inevitable unless your goal is to weaponize them in some way or direct them away from yourself. So it seems in this case, the irony would be that, to take a leadership position for these young men would be to gather them up around you. But I think what people are starting to feel, it's like, well, that's a dead end. What you want is someone who's going to get people and almost educate them and send them out to better their lives, because no one's lives are better by gathering around a content creator. That's just that I've seen them come and go. And a lot of the young guys who fall for it, they've never seen it before. But if you're 50 years old, you've probably seen this 4 times. There's always been Andrew Tates around. Andrew Tate is just the latest, weirdest version, tailor-made for sort of a multi-polarity angle. Like, tailor-made for the fact that the red pill sphere is all, like, non-white guys now, and it used to be mostly, like, white divorced guys talking about legal problems and how to, like, rebalance everything, and now it's all, like, black guys making fun of whores, which is good entertainment. Don't get me wrong. Who doesn't like making fun of whores more than me? Nobody. However, it does feel like a lateral step in the whole men's rights. What are young men to do? We're still kind of yelling at whores, but what? So to solve the incel problem, you would almost need an anti-leader. You need someone who wants to bestow leadership qualities to everyone they meet, which is completely antithetical to how a lot of these guys operate. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like these kind of ideas outside yourself, like things like you have to go work out, you have to go be social, you have to go make friends, like build like networks, right? In business, like life to be successful as young men. Because like they do have a point with their grievances, they are aggrieved by the system. They don't have women. That's true. Like here's the thing, either you like take action or you bitch on the internet forever and you vicariously live through Andrew Tate thinking that somehow you're going to become him one day so you could be a degenerate like him essentially, because that's what these people are doing, right? It's living vicariously with this like fake notion in their minds, right? If they just spend enough time watching their videos or pay enough money at Hustlers
Yeah.
University, they're going to
Hey
get the
guys,
secret.
I hate to break it to these guys, or maybe I do like to break it to them. It doesn't take a whole lot of skill to start an online casino and traffic in very, very poor and very, very sad women. Idiots do it all the time. You don't need to be a fucking MIT graduate to be a pimp, right? You can do it. That's a lot of people, they choose not to because it's reprehensible. It's actually not that cool. And if you see Andrew Tate with his sunglasses off, he looks like a strange loser. You know what I mean? Like, if there's no shirt tight enough to actually make this guy cool. He's the type of guy who couldn't even pay a hooker to fuck him, so he had to actually own hookers. You know what I mean? Like Elon Musk, he doesn't need to pay for sex. Andrew Tate couldn't even pay for sex. He had to turn women into capital and put them into a bank account so he could have access to them. That's not what you guys want. You want to, and this is one thing I say about incels, because I remember the rise of the incel movement. And a lot of people are like, oh, these guys they just want to get laid. Why can't they just pay for a prostitute? And me, when I would listen to them, I would always hear they seem to be looking for love more often than not. They want a girlfriend because they know they can go on, OnlyFans, not OnlyFans, Tinder,
Well,
and
they can go watch porn every day of the week if they want to. There's like endless consumption of that garbage, thrown at their trough essentially, right? But what
yeah.
they want is genuine stuff, which is hard to come by.
That's why I don't even like incel, because I remember the first guys who started using incel. These really were unhinged men who were pissed off that they just couldn't have sex. But for me, when I look at the movement, it's like lonely guys. But that's different than guys who are unfuckable. And I would argue most incels are also temporarily incels. I've seen guys like claim they're incels and they just got divorced or something. It's like, no, you had it and you're going through a dry spell. But that's not all. A dry spell isn't an identity. We've all had that. Look, everyone's been divorced. Every, everyone's got two ex-wives. You don't need to make a whole political ideology behind it, right? But I'm curious from your perspective as a Zoomer, and this is one thing we wanted to talk about. I don't know if we talked about it last time, but where I'm kind of locked away from this. Where's the incel thing at? Is that still a problem? Have people kind of moved past that, or is that still a big issue for especially young men now?
I would say it's actually gotten even worse than when we last talked about it. I think the number is like 3 out of 10. No, it's like 8 out of 10 men have had sex in the last year, basically, and it's only growing, right? And you can live vicariously through these like online fantasies, and that's obviously a part of it. But I think the bigger thing is just like the sheer apathy of young white men, because on a deep psychological, like subconscious level, they realize that the system is fundamentally against them and their interest, and there's no place for them in the new future. So why bother showing up for it when you can have KFC and porn every day and play video games? I think that's a bigger, deeper subconscious reason for why it's growing, why it's a big thing, and why it's still a big thing. It's not changing because at the end of the day, right, a lot of the reason men used to form relationships was because society pressured them to do so. Otherwise, they were going to die and leave no offspring, right? And also because there was also another reason behind that as well, was just because you wanted an offspring, even though it's inherently a good thing. It's also kind of because there's a train of thought here. It's because you don't want to be a loser. You don't want to be the community, dunce at the end of the day. Like these people have always existed in society, right? Basically, the untouchables and undesirables who are kind of thrown out. And like now that's an attractive identity in the place of anything genuine or meaningful, right? I think that's the deeper reason why. Obviously, there are ugly people, and those people have always existed in society. You're always going to have that 1% of the bell curve, right? But that's not the majority of these people. That's not even like 2% of these people. The majority of these people is just sheer apathy.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I'm starting to relate that a bit to the IQ bell curve as well, because you mentioned the bell curve, and this is a position we've taken before in the past. It's that just for people who haven't heard it, the bell curve popularized by Charles Murray in his book, The Bell Curve. A lot of people haven't actually read that book. Very interesting book. They concentrate on the race part in the middle, which is true and valid and brave. But the message of the book overall is that yes, there is a bell curve for IQ. It's mostly gathered at average IQ, but there's extremes at both ends. And it's true that the black IQ bell curve is a couple standard deviations to the left of the white one. So on average, they're stupider. However, the main takeaway is that despite that, there's still a lot of low IQ whites, no matter how you slice it. And something needs to be done with them because unskilled labor is evaporating. We don't have ways for these people to support themselves, and from a system point of view, any system that generates enemies to that system is a broken system, and those systems tend to collapse. And you can look at that completely, unemotionally, right? It's not a value judgment on the system. It's just it doesn't work if it generates too many enemies. And so, if you have a courtship system, or a civilizational system where that left tail of that bell curve has always existed. There's always going to be people too ugly to fuck, right? But what we're noticing, just like the IQ, it's that it's swallowing up more and more of the middle of that bell curve. There's more average people. Or in the IQ sense, there's more people of average intelligence who can't find jobs. They are falling into that low IQ bucket functionally. So they're being locked out of what used to be afforded to higher IQ people. So they have strange bedfellows with very low IQ, sometimes criminally insane people. But now there's people who are not ugly and completely unfuckable, regular guys, regular gals who are being grouped into that bucket as well. And that's a system that's unsustainable, I think. And we can quibble over causes, but to me, just from a systems point of view, this system has generated too many enemies to it, and they're going to just destroy it at some point. And I don't know what precisely that looks like. That could just be the complete cratering of birth rates. That could be an epidemic of rape. I don't know. Like there's going to be some weird shit that happens. The only thing that could head that off at the pass are environmental or biological factors. I'm thinking too much plastic in the blood, dropping testosterone levels, crippling apathy and nihilism. Those could stand in the way as well. But that's also just another type of systems collapse as well. That just means that it cannot be course corrected through sudden or even tyrannical violence, which is used to be what happened in the past. Then what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right. There was a certain YouTuber who I'm not going to name because he's cringe, who had a great point about the former, which you just said. Eventually, you get to a point with systems and the way patronage and regime groups, client groups of the regime work, right? Where you create such a big people who are outside the bubble that they have no stake in the system. So they could not give a less of a shit if the whole thing burned down, right? This is where the synergism of if you don't give the young men a place at the village, they'll burn it down to feel its warmth, right? And essentially, that's what's happens in like Western society as a whole. When you look at white men, but not just Western society. If you look at like Asian societies as well, this is a big thing. I'm noticing there too. It's not exclusively a white thing.
Yeah, birth rates are collapsing everywhere, and that doesn't get brought up enough. And it's been that way for a while. And we're even talking India. I think the only place that isn't doing so bad might be parts of Africa, but that's being buoyed by just capital infusion. And if they were just left to their own devices, it would plummet as well. South Korea, all throughout Asia, all throughout the Middle East, even as far as I can tell.
No, this trend is going everywhere. Like even those countries which you bring up, the Maghreb countries, which have always had the highest birth rates, because just low IQ people breeding. Even those places are being destroyed with the creep of modernity. And an interesting thing, like there's a study out of India where it's like, even if you just give a woman like access to soap operas, the birth rates go down measurably.
Really?
This has a measurable effect. If you give women technology, if you give them a place outside the hierarchy where they're supposed to be, right? It's like trying to fit a round hole in a square hole. It's not going to work, and eventually the mechanisms which keep it in a healthy equilibrium are going to go out of fucking whack. And this is what you see across the Western world, right? And they're just being used, that like anger and out of placeness is being used, right, by the regime as a great political megaphone for whatever they want them to be for, right?
I'm just I'm looking at a site, a page from the American Economic Association, soap operas and fertility evidence from Brazil. This is just what I pulled up based on what you're saying because I wanted to just check that out, and just the abstract. We'll have a look at that because I'm not paying for anything ever. We estimate the effect of television on fertility in Brazil, where soap operas portray small families. We exploit differences in the timing. Women living in areas covered by Globo have significantly lower fertility. The effect is strongest for women of lower socioeconomic status and in the central and late phases of fertility, consistent with stopping behavior. What else? We provide evidence that novellas and not just television affected individual choices based on children's naming patterns and novella content. So there is a correlation between, by novellas, I believe they mean telenovelas, which are soap operas in the Latin world, the Latinx world, as we call it. So, I mean, that shouldn't be surprising. A lot of people would have intuited that on their own, but it is interesting just to see that the actual data, at least some data based on that. I don't know how many other studies there are, but do you think women take their cues from pop culture? Yes. And doesn't necessarily need to be American. That's the second question, because some people will hear that and say, oh, this is, the GAE, right? This is Turbo America projecting its values elsewhere. I'm like, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, are Americans making these sitcoms? I mean, I don't know. Is it more or less dangerous, I guess? Is it more or less severe if this is just something that seems to be happening? Like, does America need to be connected to creating these cultural trends, or is it just something that's kind of happening? Like, it would make sense in South Korea, but it actually doesn't make that much sense in China right now, because you're seeing birth rates totally collapse in China for completely unrelated reasons, it seems. Same thing with Russia, like we had said. So could this be like we talk about modernity? Is that just a weapon of the American empire, or is it just this, I don't know, like an existential virus that's hitting everywhere? I'm not sure which is worse.
I'm going to take the unpopular opinion that many people don't like. America is not the source of all evil in the world. I think that's pretty sane position to hold. But like as you said in that latter half, like the force we call modernity, like wokeness, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, is a totalizing force that seeks control of not just like the West in some abstract sense, even though it does have control of it. It seeks total control of the entire world. It seeks total submission, total control, like total theological control of human beings at the most fundamental level. And anything opposing that must be eliminated, must be expunged as a threat, essentially. This outside force will destroy every society. We even see that in the based Muslim countries and Mohammedans, right? That Andrew Tate loves to suck off, right? Even in like Saudi Arabia, where they have extremely strict conservative laws, right? We see those being whittled away, right? We see the birth rates kind of collapse. We see women become more free. We see gayness be more accepted in society. And what do those things follow? They follow total collapse given enough time, right? Because again, entropy is a real force in society. Like, you have to be constantly pushing against entropy. Otherwise, entropy is going to win by default because entropy is easier,
Yeah.
essentially.
This reminds me of an interview I just saw recently, and don't get mad at me. It was Lex Friedman, and he was interviewing a biographer of Osama bin Laden, one of the few biographers, not only of his life, but also his writings. And he made a good point that in the wake of 9/11, there actually wasn't a lot of academic or cultural interest in what Osama bin Laden was actually saying. The line that, even because I'm old enough to remember that period, I remember the line was, they hate us because they ain't us. And they're jealous of us, and that's it. They're crazy. They're fundamentalists. And there's still a lot of people that probably believe that. But he was looking at his writings and actually looking at where Osama bin Laden came from. And it was kind of interesting because, and this guy was like a former CIA guy too. So, take that for what it is. But what he had said, I thought was interesting because it lines up with a lot of what we know about Osama bin Laden, which is that, he's from a Saudi royal family. His entire family was highly educated, pretty successful, family of engineers. He went to school for engineering with something like a Western education, but they were still Islamic. They still believed in the jihad. But their version of jihad was like, oh, we're going to build things to help refugees and shit. And then he's sort of the black sheep. He goes and starts this whole fucking movement. But one thing he had said was that a lot of the most staunch fundamentalists were products of this sort of new Islamic secularism. So they were almost products of modernity. And a lot of the Islamic scholars didn't like them because they took a more extreme approach to the Islamic doctrine. I don't know if that's true. I'm not totally knowledgeable about that sphere, but there you see an interesting instance where modernity, was birthing a more extreme Islamism, so it's like you have, but also these would be the guys who might be dabbling in prostitutes and drugs, and Al Qaeda and the Taliban. They used to rebel, the Taliban especially, and the Mujahideen. They rebelled against technology at one point. They were telling stories about how they hated Western media. They would be ripping up videotapes and cassettes and stringing them from trees in the sort of effigy against technology itself. Flash forward to now, and they have, almost like Hollywood budgets for their propaganda. They've embraced multimedia in a way that, is actually probably against their doctrine. So that's in one case where modernity doesn't necessarily mean westernization. Modernity, it was like more extreme Islamism, but a betrayal of other values at the same time. That could, I also, maybe ironically, lead or open the door to lower birth rates, to increased secularization in other areas as well. That's just one example that sprang to mind.
No, I think that's a very cogent point. I think that reaction that you speak of is actually something we call like antibody resistance, right? Because every society and country, no matter like how like a much a shithole they are, does have this like seemingly have this force of antibodies which seek to protect the core, right, from like degeneracy, basically the societal like suicide switch, right, which is basically what's going on in the West, right, where you reach this level of total degeneracy and like total hedonism, where essentially the society is set to kill itself, right? It doesn't breed, doesn't produce anything, doesn't produce anything new, and it stagnates and declines, and the results are predictable from there. So societies have something akin to antibodies which seek to try to fight those forces of modernization and like foreign ideas, foreign film, new technologies which seek to uproot and change sometimes like centuries or even hundreds of years of tradition and uproot their societies into something completely new.
No, yeah, I agree completely. So just to circle back to the incel thing, is that something that was that a topic at, let's say, the old Glory Club conference? Is that something that still gets talked about amongst like your friends or your circles?
Not on the intellectual level of the speakers and general conference goers, but in Discord chats and Telegram chats and spaces less academic and less intellectual and more meme space. Yes, the incel talk is still very much discussed on a regular basis, just because like it's such a lived reality for so many people, especially young people, that you can't really ignore it in a sense if you're young and you like know where these people congregate. Like you see the effects like their presence has on society, even if they don't like themselves speak. Their force and what they're doing to society does speak for itself in a sense.
What's interesting. I'm not sure you caught this, but I think it was last week I did a live stream panel. And actually, I discussed this with the Prudentialist on our last live stream as well. But I did a big live stream with Alaric the Barbarian and Prudentialist and John Doyle and Steve Saylor and a baby boomer named Herb. And it was supposed to be boomers versus zoomers, sort of bridging the generational divide and figuring out ways to pass the torch from boomers to the young people. And one thing that we encountered, there's a few walls there that I don't think older generations were willing to move past. And one of them would have been the incel thing, which is if you talk to them about it, they're just like, young people aren't having sex. What's up with them? Why don't they just do it? So there's sort of a conceptual block there. We have to explain, no, they want to, but they can't. Like you need to really explain the entire culture, which they are completely removed from, to get them to understand why that's happening. Because to the older generations, this is just a weird, random thing that's happening. And they're the ones who possess a lot of the capital and influence, and they're still oftentimes in the organs of power in society. And you had said something very interesting, which is that do Zoomers take advice from older generations? And I wanted to hear what you thought about that. What do you think about older generations giving advice, and what's your experience there?
Well, I think knowledge transference, right, is a very good and like old tradition of the West, right? Even when you go back just like 50, 60 years sometimes, this was a tradition of like the grandfather or father would hand down the knowledge that his father and his grandfather taught his son. Like it could be simple as things like a natural, like medicinal, like recipe to cure poison ivy, or something like how to change a carburetor on a car, like how to properly shoot a gun, like how to hunt, like how to like be successful in life to where you're a net positive to society and not a net negative, a useless eater essentially, right? And that was very common, and that was an expected thing that was the younger generations were supposed to receive, right? And essentially what we saw with the baby boomers, not I'm going back to the baby boomers here, was like that kind of got like thrown out the window essentially with the baby boomers. Because what you had with the baby boomers was they were born into this most unique situation where the US became the like one of the two sole superpowers in the world. And like the US economy just had this renaissance of just new capital coming into it and manufacturing after World War II. And like land was cheap, houses were cheap, and the income of an average baby boomer. So we're not talking about higher middle class, upper middle class here. We're talking about your average Joe here who works at like the local steel mill or Walmart of the time, right? Somebody who's not like a wealthy person, like below 100K even sometimes. These people on average could afford like a house that was $120,000 within a year or two of their salary, and were able to support them and like 3 kids.
Yeah, and one thing that occurred to me, baby boomers, and I don't want to hammer them too much here, but there's something interesting about them and maybe even their parents as well. They are truly products of the Industrial Revolution. So, and we were kind of touching on this earlier in the interview here, but they believe that, oh, it's just something that you do. You graduate school, then you get married, then you have kids, and one leads to the other as if it were an automatic sequence. And they truly believed in that automatic sequence, and it almost never betrayed them once they were in it. Sometimes it did, but they still believed in that sequence generally. And I don't believe that we believe in that sequence anymore. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think one is that we don't really subscribe to the Industrial Revolution model of production anymore. We're an information based society, so it's a matrix or a network based thing. So it demands more interactivity. Our understanding of society is a lot more nuanced and zoomed in. So we actually, no young person believes at all. Ask them if they graduate school, if they can expect a fucking job. No one believes that anymore. Now no one believes that if I get married, like maybe I have kids and maybe I don't. That's not for certain anymore. There's zero certainty levels of this circuit, and people have kind of realized that it's actually this multi latitudinous thing. And so I think that's where people are kind of overwhelmed, that there is no if then sequence anymore to society. And that's where baby boomers, I think, in older generations, if they're still around, that's their fundamental disconnect. It's that the society that they live in was one that if you work you get reward. That's just what happens. How could that not happen? And I think millennials, Gen X too, probably, there's no correlation between work and reward anymore. Like, and so how do you know how can you feel good about doing anything? And that might sound kind of dour, but what do you think about that?
No, I think you're pointing to a very real phenomenon here that like the baby boomers like experienced this most like unique time essentially in history. This like you know steel needle in a haystack, right? Where like everything on the assembly line worked, right? For like 99% of them, right? And that obviously produced the people who were obviously totally loyal to the regime in power, because the regime in power brought them untold prosperity. A new house, a new car, 3 children, a wife, right, which you had sex with regularly, like a society that was healthy, right, a community, a church. All these things were a given. It wasn't even a question. They were going to be there, right? And so those people, when you're heavily bred up with that mindset and the idea that the conveyor belt is working towards a positive end, aren't going to give up that idea very easily. And as like we know, as you grow older, the effort it takes to change your perceptions and ideas increases to a point where it's basically impossible to change an old person's mind. And we see that in the graphs on this idea. And that's what's essentially what happened to the baby boomers. And like, this is the reason why younger Gen millennials and like Zoomers just don't believe in that at all. Because they realize from a very early age that like these promises that the baby boomers and Gen X were telling them were never going to happen. And what essentially was the catalyst for that was 9/11. Because what 9/11 did was it kind of shook us out of like the echoes of the 90s, right? Where that world could still be possible. You could still afford a house on $100,000 salary. You still have like two kids, and like your community was okay. For if you just put in the bare amount of work, right, that you were going to inherit. And like that, essentially, that was all ripped up and destroyed. And essentially, the revolution like hit full steam at that point, and all these like things essentially became obstacles to the total state, as Aaron McIntyre likes to call it. So they were assimilated and destroyed, and those promises became mute. That social construct was ripped up, and so Zoomers don't recognize the legitimacy of it at all.
Yeah, and that leads me to, I guess, my next question, which is I was building to. It's that for young people, young men especially now, there is this yearning for the traditional to be revived, especially in romantic relationships, right? Everyone wants to find the type of girl that might have existed in the fucking 50s or something. And one does wonder, we talked about a lot of very distinct pressures that are being exerted upon young people now. You got the plastic in your blood, you got the dropping testosterone, drop
It's
cratering
not just
birth.
in your blood; it's in your balls
It's
too. Don't
right,
forget that.
right there in the balls. Sperm counts are dropping. That's a big thing. What's happening to the female reproduction system, the reproductive system rather? There's a lot of estrogen in the water supply. That's not good. I don't know what to do about that. So there's a lot of that, but what I'm trying to get at is that I think these generations, and I include millennials here, are fundamentally more broken than any time in the past. People are fatter too. That's another one. I mean, you could list things off for fucking days. But I'm thinking like, can fundamentally broken people even achieve any sort of tradition? And do they need to, work with what they've got, even though it's not ideal? And that's a dangerous thing to say because a lot of people in our spaces, and I hear them, they're saying like, no, you need to have your values, you need to have your principles. I don't want to marry a weird, fucked up girl. But the odd, honestly, like if you're in the dating market now, the odds of finding a woman who's not some level of feminist are pretty low. You're seeing a lot of people, women especially, exit the OnlyFans cycle, which is good because they realize they're being uh, e-whores for $0. But that you're probably going to find one or two. You're going to find like the perfect girl who maybe had an OnlyFans account for a while. And I'm not trying to say that guys need to like make peace with that, but I am wondering, there's a feminine perspective there where even the guys are kind of weird and fucked up too. And no one's perfect right now. And at what point do we have to put, because people throughout time have dealt with these pressures. And when I was on King Pilled not long ago, we were talking about this very same topic, and people could find that live on his channel. We also had that on one of our episodes. I was just hypothesizing, and I said, for one example, after the fall of Berlin was the rape of Berlin after World War II, where something to the tune of 200,000 women were raped, and the abortion clinics were filled up. They're raped by invading Soviet soldiers and probably some American soldiers too. So if you're a German man, you had to deal with the reality that you were living in a fundamentally broken society at that point. Military occupation, humiliation, your women have been defiled. And do you allow that to be the end of the German civilization? And this has been the problem presented to many societies throughout history, especially those conquered societies who got out of it later. And so I was just wondering, I'm like, things aren't right now as bad as that, obviously. I'm not trying to say that they were, but at a certain point, do you have to say, okay, at a certain point, we need to just have families with what we got? And you can rank the women however you want. Like they need to be a virgin, highly unlikely that you're going to find that, especially if they're like in their mid 20s. So you got to make peace with that. Now, they don't need to have a body count in the fucking 20s, but I think there is some readjustment of values that has to occur. I don't know. Like, is what I'm saying make sense, or what do you think about that?
No, I think it makes logical sense. This like notion that like traditionalists like Zoomers and millennials are like clinging on to like like opium, essentially snorting it by the kilo, is like this idea that like your Murdoch, your Murdoch Chan is just out there. If you just look for her, if you just look hard enough, she's out there, undefiled by modernity, and like saving her virginity, for a internet schizophrenic who studies the Austrian painter with his free time, right? And that's a very unhealthy like mental space to be in, because like it puts you in a place where you can't actually do things proactively. Like you kind of have to understand that like, listen, we're children of the ashes here. Most women are whores. Most women have done OnlyFans. Most women have had more than one partner, unfortunately. That's the society we live in. And like, is it ideal? Fuck no, it's
Yeah.
not. But like you have to do something here, because like again, society is not guaranteed to you. Your country is not guaranteed to you. You have to fight and earn it, actually.
Yeah.
And that's
And
what
also,
each generation does.
just to be gender balanced here, one example of how what women have to deal with is like the men who have been poisoned by pornography, and that's not a judgment. That's something that I would argue most guys go through. Even my generation went through that, because we were hit like a fucking freight train with free pornography. There was a time when porn wasn't free on the internet, and then one day it just was, and I don't know how it happened. And then a lot of guys went through that ringer. But a lot of guys, if they get in a serious relationship, if you're a woman, they're going to come with some weird fucking fetish. Not all of them, but more than there used to be. I bet there's a lot more foot guys than there's ever been in the past. So that's just a weird, broken thing that people need to deal with now. But, it's the propagation of the fucking species at the end of the day, and not to say that you need, like, we do need standard to have an idea of who you wouldn't date, but I'm also not trying to make the argument that some make, which is like, be a man, just date her, date flaws and all. I'm like, okay, well, there need to be some flaws that you wouldn't date, just like women with men, like it's okay to have standards, but I'm thinking that, there needs to be a bit more blurring around the edges if it is going to get as bad as I think it is. Like the numbers keep getting worse year over year. What women now too, just not having sex, which doesn't mean that the hypergamy rule has been broken. It doesn't mean that they're not at the very top, that the hottest people aren't still fucking around, but there are troubling numbers that I think we need to reckon with at some point. But, on the other hand, this is based on the data that I've seen. It does seem that white people of a certain socioeconomic status are the ones uh, totally breaking the fertility rate rule. And I think that is ideologically and maybe even religiously driven. Like people who are choosing, for maybe even eugenics purposes, to have 7, 10 kids. And I think that's interesting. I think that the only people who are breaking that rule are like not even the super wealthy whites, like Elon Musk, who's just having 20 kids for the heck of it, but like middle class people who are doing it. And I think it's for, it's not just by accident, is what I'm saying.
No, these things are done by an intention and usually a deep conviction. And like when you look at those like subgroups in modernity, which have a replacement rate that's above like one McChicken nugget, essentially, right? Is these groups are deeply, they usually have a deep religious and like national like component to them, right? So a great example was like the Amish, right? The Amish are they're deeply like culturally homogenous group, like ethnic Germans who are Anabaptist, right? And they cling to that very seriously. When you look at their birth rates, it's above like one chicken McNugget, essentially. And you see their population growing, while the secular whites do not grow. But there's other groups of this too, which buck the trend, right? And it's usually like conservative Catholics who have a deep conviction that they want to like repopulate their church with based people of the future generations, right? And they're going to have to be the ones who do this. Or it's, like, nationalist men in Europe in France and Germany who are like, well, if they're going to import, the Muslims and Mohammedans, like, you have to do your job to produce a counter to this like threat, and that means you have to like have white babies, which is something most people don't want to hear for some reason, because
Yeah, which is interesting because, like, the way I look at it, if we're trying to put a positive spin on this, what we are experiencing right now is sort of eugenic bottleneck where the having kids, and this was kind of the unfortunate. I'm not a pro-abortion guy, but it did seem that certain groups that we would like to have abortions were having the most abortions. And I say good for them. I just don't want our guys doing it. But we are seeing sort of a genetic bottleneck where the types of people who you would want reproducing are the ones who are doing it completely, which is the ones who are like saying, I want my legacy to survive. I need to find a woman of good stock and good character to do it with and have this many kids because I'm trying to build something, with that. We mentioned Charles Haywood. I think he's kind of on that tip, but there's other guys who are doing it, but it's not accidental and it's not on that sort of automatic boomer conveyor belt, which is this is just what you do. It's like I need to do it like it's homework. I think, and honestly, this is what I'm seeing, especially with my generation. And I'm curious to hear what you think. I'm seeing more young men who are excited about being fathers. And this was not what I saw at all with a lot of the baby boomers. Even the ones who are good fathers, they just kind of saw it as even marriage itself, they saw as like a dull obligation. But I don't know. I'm curious. I know there's some boomers that might push back on that, but like I'm seeing a lot of like young guys who are really, really excited about it. Some would say that's even bad, that's too feminine. However, that's just something I'm noticing. And I think that goes hand in hand with the incel thing. Like there's more guys saying not I just want to get laid. It's like I want to be a dad, which I don't maybe that wasn't as common in the past. What do you think about that?
well, I don't know if it was more common, but I think what we're seeing here is a genuine like rediscovery. Like you can call it traditionalism, radicalism, reactionaryism, essentially, right? Which whatever ideologies behind it is, you see this like group of Gen Z. It's like 30 or 40% who is just completely against the system, completely understands like the program they have for them in life, and is like, I don't want that. That's not the life I want. I don't want to become a useless bugman who consumes vouch content and watches Coca-Cola all day, right? Like I want a higher calling. I want something deeper, right? I want something outside myself, right? It's this idea of like planting the oak tree whose shade you shall never enjoy, but your offspring shall enjoy it, but you shall not. Idea, right? Like recurring to the surface again. And this used to be a much more common idea in the West, right? Because the West used to be called Christendom for a reason, and there was a deeply religious conviction behind it that was driving this notion. Now, obviously, as the West became more secular in the 19th century, it kind of became, like you said, an obligation to have children. It was what was expected. It was what a upstanding man of the middle class and upper middle class was expected to do. And like obviously that was going to produce subpar results, no matter which way you look at it. And the people who were enthusiastic about accepting responsibility and like producing something beyond themselves, like they're much better parents. When you look at the quality of their children too, it's much higher. They tend to read much more books. They tend to like go play sports more. They tend to be much more physically impressive. They tend to just be like better people overall, like quality wise. And I think that's going to have a component too in the future.
Yeah, and that's one thing I noticed, especially with my grandfather, but a lot of people's grandfathers, like they thought that being hands off with raising the children was the way to go. That's the man's job, the masculine thing to do. But then they would complain later that they're just treated like a wallet. They're only treated like, oh, I'm here for my money, and it's like, well, that is the consequence, and that was an unfortunate consequence for them to learn. But also, you have to think, if you want to take a misogynistic angle, which I do, it's like if I'm a man, why do I want my kids raised by a single mom? Imagine kids raised by a woman. The thought of it should shivers down your spine. So if you're a father, it's like you kind of want to be involved just to make sure that your kids come out all right. And I think that's the angle that I take in raising. But I think there's more young people willing to do that now, and you could say that even emerges from a eugenics or a eugenicist's perspective, which is I want to create a good genetic stock to do something with it, not just out of you know boring obligation and then surrendering those kids to the state. Because another phenomenon you're seeing in society is like there's always been the homeschooling movement, but the homeschooling movement, in my view, and I deal off and on again with homeschooling advocates and groups up where I am. It's bigger than ever before. There's more people willing to check out of that system, and I think the desire to pull for parents to pull kids out of public institutions, I don't have the numbers to back this up, but I think it's got to be as high as ever. And again, because people don't trust institutions, they don't believe in the conveyor belt of society. So they feel like, but there are groups that will still do that. Like most, Indians, Arabs, blacks, they have no problem just trusting in the system still, even though they claim they hate the system, they still kind of implicitly believe in its bureaucracy, and we don't. And I think that itself is almost a eugenicist better stock that will survive that bottleneck, which is kind of what I was getting at before. And that, this could be a beneficial thing. But if you're the type who listens to these interviews or this content, you're probably the type of person who, even if you see yourself as an incel, you imagine yourself breaking out of it for that purpose. So I think that's really even though it's kind of depressing for them right now, it's like that sort of drive, I think, will probably see you through that bottleneck. As long as you look at it, like I'm trying to find a woman to start a family with, and literally write down what values you think they need to have, aside from, looking hot, although that's good as well. That's why that whole fucking discourse on beautiful mids is so good. I never thought it had to be said, but yeah, beautiful mids. Mids are great. Get a mid. Get a girl whose eyes are slightly too far apart. You'll be fine.
No, I think I agree with you very much in that regard. This like higher calling and sense of duty, this like overcoming the genetic bottleneck, like drives in. Like let me give you an example. Like young men who are losers for a lot of parts of their lives, like will have this calling at some times where they'll break out of it, and it'll be just this fire that drives them that like says like, listen, you are going to be a dead end, and there will be no more of you unless you get your ass off the couch and go do the hard shit necessary that makes you attractive enough for a woman who wants to breed with you, essentially. And there's also other higher components to it as well, but like that's a big component. Like like that's a big drive for why men improve themselves, is this idea of their like being worthy of having offspring. Like you have to attract the opposite sex. And you're not going to do that when you have a 30-pound Cheeto cut and you play Call of Duty and are like level 55 prestige. I'm sorry, that just isn't attractive.
You, you,
Idea.
and you know what? Just to stop there for a second, because I do want to mention that one thing I've noticed, and we did a whole arc on our show about, food additives and vaccines and things like that. But one thing you notice, and everyone shows the fuck it, what was it? There's an episode where we reviewed this really great series of articles about what was leading to the obesity epidemic, and it doesn't actually have anything to do with people's diets. Because people are eating healthier than they've ever eaten before. They're eating healthier than the boomers did. Boomers ate loads of bread, loads of bacon, loads of fat. And it's like, well, what's causing the obesity epidemic? And you would see photos of the baby boomers on a beach, and like everyone's in shape. There's no fat people. You walk around, it's kind of rare to see a fat person, but now everyone is technically fat. Um, and also even the guys who do take their fitness seriously, it seems that they need to work 5 times harder to get in shape, to get like used to be you can go to a gym rarely and lift a bit and it would show. But now, like you listen to a lot of fitness guys, and this is something I'm into as well because, I've got a home gym and stuff. Like you have to put a microscope to your diet and count macros and go to the gym every single day to be fit for a lot of people, which is fucking insane. But anyway, it was this article that it named 4 reasons why people actually just do struggle to lose weight, even though they're healthier than ever before and have better habits. One was actually estrogen in the water supply. Another one is lithium. The presence of lithium in the water supply as well. Seed oils was another big one. The move to seed oils and corn and everything. There was a fourth one that escapes my mind, but the main thing was like it's actually has more to do with, even when you eat healthy food, there's these like biological presences in the food that just make everyone kind of fat. And so it does suck that if you want to, even the people who want to be fit and have drive and discipline, like a lot of them have to make, you have to make that your entire fucking life. So it's hard just to make yourself into a specimen a lot of the time.
I mean, that is a good point you bring up there, but it's kind of like, what's the alternative here?
Exactly. I
It's
don't
like,
know. I don't know how to clean the water. Like that's the other thing people talk about. Oh, there's plastic in your blood and the water and lithium and birth control. I'm like, I haven't heard a single person talk about how we can clean the water from that. That just seems like that's the ultimate black pilling thing. I'm like we're fucked in that sense. What do you do?
well, there's no good answers to that question. There's a lot of bitching and moaning about how hard it is. And maybe some water filters would help out with that. But like at the end of the day, like I think they even did this study where like they took glass water bottles, right, which have premium like seltzer water in them, right, and they still find microplastics in them. So you're not safe even if you like go for this healthier option, which is more expensive, right? You're not safe.
Now, consider this. If everyone became an alcoholic, and I mean a fall down drunk, and we also had no drunk driving laws just to make it easier, would that solve the plastic in the blood dilemma and also the birth rate crisis? Like I think a drunk America can accomplish a lot of these tasks. I think if every American is drunk for a year, once people emerge from their blackout state, a lot of these problems are gone. Yeah, and people are like, oh, ha ha, hardy har har dimes, but really though, you're gonna leave the stream, you're gonna go think about it, you're gonna dream about it. A real drunk America, like you used to have. That was America for the longest time. Everyone was drunk and smoking cigarettes, and things got done. Oh, that's a meme opinion. Well, I am a fucking meme, so. But am I wrong?
I mean, here's the thing though, even like the men I met at the OGC conference are big on this. Like, listen, America runs on alcohol and tobacco, whether you like it or not. And like the society that like consumed those things on a daily basis was extremely healthy based, had a massive empire, great, great architecture, hot women, like was a place you wanted to live in,
And even
right?
if they're not hot women, they'll get hot if you're drunk enough. Like people, you got to think this all the way down to the bottom. You
And
want
like
to talk about
here's the
talk about
other thing.
remigration? Remigration makes a lot more sense when you're fucking blitzed.
Well, here's the other thing. Your like drunk thesis is like, well, clearly whatever we're fucking doing like isn't working, and people want to like, go into suicide pods essentially over living in our current time. So clearly, anything is better than that. Is my thing. Honestly, even if you like your basic thesis is like we should be smoking cigarettes all day, well, that actually might be a good a applicable solution compared to the modernity we live in, where suicide pods and becoming a troon are the hallmarks of our day.
Yeah, everyone out there fucking loves science. Why don't we just try it? It's called an experiment. And maybe it fails, but then we'll know. This whole
Ex-
yeah, my whole thing is like I quit drinking like 4 years ago. So this whole ideology is me like I should start drinking heavily and smoking cigarettes again. That's going to be my politics. No, it's I'm being an agent of change, honey.
well, consider this, right? I mean, like the era of change we have today wants people to liquidate themselves and their traditions and culture, and produces the people who are so apathetic and so dysgenic that they can't even find the fucking motivation to go breed with their own women. They have to go find that in Asia or something. And they don't even believe in a future for them and their like offspring, right? So even if your basic thesis is completely wrong, it doesn't produce anything. It probably is still more successful than what we're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and I'm up here in Canada, and there's a lot of people who are very seriously talking about abandoning the country, and they might be able to trace their roots back, 10 generations. I mean, Canada's not technically as old as America, but there's a lot of like very strong bloodlines here. And that there's people who you would never imagine talking about leaving the country just because it's gotten so bad. And my co-host is vehemently opposed to that, and so am I, in the sense I'm like, there's nowhere to run to. There's a lot of you'll see nationalists be like, we should run away to Eastern Europe for a while. And maybe that sounds good in the moment, but you know being an immigrant isn't easy. You know what I mean? Like, we have this idea of like, oh, well, we're Americans, we're Canadians, like they're gonna love us there. It's like, no, you're just a fucking foreigner. You're just a guy there to like take jobs and speak the language poorly and bring in your own culture which they don't like. I'm like, you're never gonna be comfortable. And I always come back to that. Like, it doesn't matter if the houses are cheaper there. It doesn't matter, like, oh, you go there with 10 grand and you could have a whole harem of slaves. I'm like, yeah, but they're not going to be my slaves. Like, I want to be able to have a higher class of slave. I want to have a mansion that isn't, filled with child bones, little things like that. You're not going to get that in Bolivia. You're not going to get that like that. You're going to get weird, haunting things in these countries that you flee to. So, you can't run. I think that was, I've seen some people talk about that on Twitter. It's like, you can't run away. They'll never leave you alone. So act accordingly, right?
Well, yes, there's many problems with the like Curtis Yarvin idea or like the expat idea. Let's become expats in our own countries because like things are so bad and there's no hope for anything that we should just go ahead and go flee to South America or Eastern Europe because well, it's easier, brah, and my money goes farther there. Essentially, idea. And there's two major problems with that. Number one, the progressive menace, which is eating your society alive as you like sit there and like do fuck all to do anything about it, usually for most people, is coming for that place too. There's nowhere where you can run where it's not coming for you. Like again, the idea that like there's one safe place you can go, even Russia, the idol of the third worldists, like Russia is becoming paused too, and we see the infiltration of modernity there as well, although it's on a slower timeline. Again, there is no place where you can go where modernity is not seeking to uproot and like consume it. There's no place you could go for that. You have to destroy the modernity itself to save your society. It's like saying you can reason with cancer so that it won't kill you. No, that's not how this works. That's not how reality works.
Yeah. And also, like we were talking about before, the transition to the sort of fifth wave information based culture has given many individuals more power than I think they were used to in the past. But one problem that we have is that we tend to talk about everything metapolitically. And when we talk about collapse, and by metapolitically, I mean not just in everyday politics and parties and politicians, but almost like when Spengler was talking about civilizations, like these vast organisms, these huge broad strokes. And so when you say like some people think modernity will collapse, and when modernity collapses, traditionalism will take over, as if these are organisms unto themselves that just move under their own power, forgetting that it just takes people to do these things. Like, tradition isn't just some spirit that will be revived on its own. It takes people to revive it and to live it and to actualize it every day. And that could be you. That could be you and your family. But like I was saying before, and this is something I always come back to, like, you need to figure out what traditionalism, if you want to call it that, makes sense. And this is why you see so many conversations about vitalism. And I've got some issues with vitalism because I'll get into that in a later episode. But at the core of it, they're trying to identify, like, what is it about that which reproduces that is beautiful and positive. Like they're trying to like drill down all the way to the bottom about like, there can be dysgenic things that propagate or there can be eugenic things that propagate, right? So we need to, and how does that manifest on an individual case by case level? As like a politic and also a praxis that you can lead every single day yourself. And so I think that's how people need to think about this. Like you are an agent of change. This starts with you. If you want to talk about surviving the bottleneck, well, that starts today. It's not going to happen for you. The collapse and then rebirth isn't going to happen without your directing it or your direct involvement in it. And that's why when I hear you talk about the whole Glory Cup conference, I think that's the wave that more and more people are riding right now. Whereas historically, they were more trying to. I found more people were trying to make predictions in the past. I have no interest in predictions. I've very rarely seen predictions be right. Geopolitically, they tend to, like from our space especially, they tend to be wrong. So why do we do them? Like, but that was in the past. Like we're trying to talk about big metapolitical issues and call shots and predict where things are going to go. None of that actually fucking matters. You know what I mean? Because if you can predict where things are going to happen, you should be making money off of it. And if you're not, that means you don't have faith in your predictions. And then why are you fucking doing them? None of this is manifesting as anything practical. And that's where I think some people are at right now, which is like, forget all these big fucking narratives. What are we doing right now to actualize the world we want? Would that be accurate?
No, I think you're completely right. It's like, listen, the world that like society that we want is not going to come about out of like some like Nietzschean idea of like taking advantage of the collapse. That's not how this is going to work. Even if like that scenario did happen and things collapsed, you and your like desperate group of people are not organized enough, not strong enough, and don't have the resources to even take advantage of the collapse. So it probably would be some lesser group of progressivism that would take over that's more organized, more financially backed, more networked, essentially, who like essentially wants it more than you do and believes they have the right to take over, essentially. That's why this like fanciful right-wing idea of the collapse is a major cope. None of these people are ready to take over. Even if the collapse happened tomorrow, you wouldn't be ready to take over. You wouldn't have the resources, the connections, the network to even take over. You'd be a desperate group of tribesmen raiding a Walmart to steal food to survive, basically, is what most of these people would be. And probably wouldn't make it much past a week, if I had to guess, judging by their physical acumens.
Yeah, and for guys, especially on our side, like we're always trying to find friends. We're always trying to find international allies, in my opinion, who don't that's not a two-way street usually. So some people are hoping that, Russia or the BRICS nations will defeat America and usher in you know, a new glory days of multipolar peace and whatever, and they'll be based. They won't be degenerate. But if you look into like BRICS, by which I mean Brazil, Russia, India,
South
China,
Africa.
South Africa. But like if you look at each of these on a case by case basis, like China is wildly degenerate. Like if you actually like my co-host who spent some time in China is like, you have no idea what pieces of shit they are. Like if you think LA is bad on like how they view human life and how they view like drugs and drinking and degeneracy, like even in Japan, something like 60% of people have had an affair, like crazy weird stuff. Like there's no like based trad nation out there, period. They hate America for geopolitical reasons, and this is sort of a power politics situation that we're dealing with. But like Russia's pretty fucking degenerate if you actually think about it. Like they're based insofar as they say sometimes they hate gays, but do they really? You know what I mean? Like their views of these things don't might not even line up with ours.
Well,
We're
here's a
like,
thought I had on this like hypercriticality of your own people and own culture that is like dominant on the American right and like every right it seems in Europe, right? It's like they see the problems of the current regime, they see the problems of the West, they see it's degenerate, they see it's declining, they see all these problems. So they become very hypercritical. However, the problem is they don't put a boundary on the hypercriticality at the source of the problem. They come to the conclusion the third worldists do that like white people, and this is similar to the left actually, even though they word it differently internally, is that white people are inherently degenerate, inherently evil. This will never inevitably happen. And the only way to get this base traditional futurism is if we become like based Black Africa, like Wakanda idea, or based like Slavic Russia. That's the only alternative, right? Because you're so hypercritical of your own people and your own ethnos that at a certain point you don't even you like look to these outside forces to fill your fantasies of what you wish your people were, right? That's where a lot of this comes from. This like uncriticalized hypercriticality.
Yeah, and also, and you mentioned this before about people who kind of view Islam favorably. A lot of like the white Sharia types of guys. They'll look at Islam like, look, hey, they subjugate women. They don't have a feminist problem. Like, buddy, we used to subjugate our women too. We were pretty good at it. We just did it our way. We can find a new way to do it without slapping them in burqas. Because by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, most women in burqas kind of let themselves go. That's not what you want. Like it seems like 90% of them turn into like fat hags. Why? Because they're wearing a burqa. What are you going to do? And they haven't figured out a way to stop that. So that's a trade off. I don't think we're prepared for because we still like ladies who are easy on the eyes. All right, so we can figure out a way to get women back in the pocket without having to like switch religions or say that they're right about they don't have any strategy that we can really borrow and apply here.
Well, no, it's looking to the foreigner. Like, here's the thing: like a lot of these criticisms, like they do the same thing the progressives do. Actually, they look to the foreigner as like the like noble savage, right? Who's uncompromised by modernity, wealth, and power, essentially, and is all good, right? All knowing, right? This is where the idea of like enlightened India comes from, right? Is this like idea, and essentially the third worldists and like some of the vitalists believe this too, except they word it differently and have a different internal structural monologue for why their version of it is actually good, essentially. And they're both wrong here. They're both an outside force, which is destroying a Western civilization they want to save.
Yeah, and also a lot of the vitalists, they're more into like I've seen a lot of substacks and posts coming out of them like, you guys are being too mean to sluts. You should be nicer to sluts. I'm like, no, we should be mean to sluts because we should desire women don't want to be that. You have to create some kind of social pressure for that not to be desirable. But there's a lot of people on our side who are trying to take the wind out of the sails on a few of our wins. Like we've actually done pretty good at shooting arrows in the knees of feminism. They're too mean. We should read Camille Paglia again. No, fuck off. We're doing a pretty good job of showing that this is a dumb thing for women to believe, and they're kind of gravitating away from that. But you have to keep the pressure up. Keep making fun of sluts. Keep making fun of e-girls. There's literally no reason to listen to an e-girl and remind them of that. There's no idea that they've ever come up with that. There's some guy that hasn't done it better. And if you subscribe to a woman's Substack, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to find you and I'm going to collect your fucking skin. Too many men are subscribing to women, and I don't like it. And I'm bringing out the fucking gallows because I'm cleaning house. And I'm not even calling it simpery. I don't even want to. If you listen to a woman's voice that's not your wife, hey, buddy, you're go lay on the train tracks. Why don't you?
Well, I think you're definitely right about that. It's this like single motherhood, basically the women's mindset and prerogative that has been installed into men because they've been raised by their single mommies all their lives, and dad was a loser who was divorced and like forced out of the house, right? And basically, all they were raised with was the female imperative, the female idea of the world, right? And that's what they're going off of. And obviously, they come up with these terms and ideas to cloud that or obscure what they actually are. At the end of the day, it's a female mindset to how they're pursuing these things. That's what makes them weak and gay at the end of the day.
No, I agree completely. I'm wondering if there's anything we didn't get to because I need to get going shortly. I think we actually covered everything I wanted to. I was wondering if before we left, if there's anything that you had on your mind, having left the Old Glory Club conference, anything else that kind of pikes your interest?
I think one of the things that piqued my interest was like how we can get more of this, because this is what we need in actuality to be successful. Groups of hyper organized people who are willing to do the hard things IRL, to build the things, to build the institutions that are going to take time, but are going to be necessary if we're going to take advantage of the coming collapse, shall we say, of the liberal world order. When and if that does indeed happen, like this like organization and spirit that we need to cultivate more, like action essentially is what I mean, but like action that is directed in a positive direction. Just action for the sake of action is not what we need. That's actually an inherent negative.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've always been fascinated by, especially on the furthest reaches of the far right, the stuff that no one wants to associate with anymore, those guys have always been pretty clear on what their goals are. And it seemed that as we drift towards the center of the more reasonable distant right, their goals become muddied. And they talk about, vagaries and stuff. But, just I'm going to say an unoptical thing, the whole like 14 words that you would get from the National Socialists. I'm like, well, that's a fucking goal. You want a future for white children. You want white children to be safe. That's what you want. Okay, then there's like three things you can do about that. But like when people talk about, what we need to do is replace liberalism with a new type of religion. When I ever hear someone say we need a new religion, I tune out. When you start, they talk about these fucking existential projects that we need to replace the global American empire with this new conglomerate of empires. Like there's nothing you can do to affect that. That's so far beyond you on fucking Twitter right now. However, if you're talking about people who've actually had measurable goals that you can tell whether or not they're working within 5 years, it's always been the furthest on the right. And I actually like that. I'm not trying to say that these people, what they're talking about, are even that far right. They're not Iron March guys or Adam Waffen or anything like that. But it's like they're talking about like, what do I want? What do I actually want? And the incel thing, I think, is a great vector for this because, like, what do you want? I want to be married with children. That's it. I can tell within a year if I'm closer to that or not. Right. So, but if you have more of those and you have rather than say, one thing that we always get stuck on this side is hyphenated identities. So, we make fun of the left for their pronouns. Well, on our side, our version of that is the hyphenated identities. Like I'm a Maoist nationalist race realist. I'm a Baptist fucking multipolarityist. Whatever, you know what I mean? Like there's people who string these together because they're like internet identities, right? But you can get lost in that. You can get lost looking for an army to join or looking for the right formula that's going to make the utopia that you don't even really have a real grasp of, versus people who actually just want a few practical things and know how to make a strategy to get there. I think though that's more what we're talking about right now as opposed to where we might have been 5-10 years ago. So don't even worry about trying to attack liberalism. Like that's not even the war you should be fighting. Like you can get five guys together and actually make moves for your own survival with people with your value set. And that will probably cascade more effectively than like trying to create a new movement on social media. What do you think about that?
I completely 100% agree. Again, it's about quality over quantity. And like, if Charlottesville didn't teach you this, I don't know what will, essentially. Mass movements, mass populism is never going to get you the victories you desire against our enemies. You're never going to win using the rules of the system they have in place. It's never going to happen. However, what you can do is if you get groups of highly motivated, high IQ men who have actionable goals and ways of organizing, suddenly these like small victories that chip away become more feasible. And those pave the way for more victories. And what does winning look like at the end of the day? It's providing the scenario for which more victories are possible against the regime. And that's the goal of these people that were in this room at the Old Glory Club all weekend, was they had that common foundation there. Even if they were, like you said, even though they had these hyphenated identities and such things, there was that like basic presupposition that rooted it at the bottom that was much needed.
You know what's interesting? And I just want to say this before we go. It's that I think our side, we don't give ourselves enough credit insofar as how much we have kind of created a parallel, at least a media ecosystem. Like for me, I get most of my news from my online community, my chat. And some people say that's an echo chamber. Yeah, just string together a few echo chambers and it's better than watching the news. That's actually a filtration system. And this was what we discussed on when we reviewed, I believe it was the Emancipation of Authorship. Like that's a necessary filtration system to make sure you receive not only the news, but also interpretations that contextualize the news through your online social circles. And I really do think that that is we like how many people. A lot of people don't know this. Jon Stewart is back on the Daily Show. Did you know that? Who's watching that? No one over here. We are so you go to like an old Glory Club conference. No one's watching them fucking Marvel movies. No one's tuned in to mainstream culture, and yet they're still getting news, and yet they're still entertained. There's not enough hours in the day to consume all of the content that they want to in the form of videos, podcasts, whatever it is. So we've actually done a pretty good job of creating a alternative parallel media ecosystem where we don't even need to fucking give them our dollar. Like we're just looking at screenshots of their news articles so they don't even get ad revenue based on that. That creates its own problems sometimes. But I think that when people look at that as a problem, I actually think that's a benefit that we're already getting used to checking out of that entire system. And that's a necessary step to creating alternatives. And anyway, that's just a little bit of optimism.
No, I think you're completely right. Like the first step to realizing you're in a rigged game is to stop playing the game. Ultimately, you have to stop playing the game if you want to like flip the board over. Essentially, you have to flip over the chessboard entirely at the opponent, because clearly you're never going to win using their rules, their logic, their presupposition, their language, their ideology at the forefront.
Exactly. All right. So where can people find you? Because I know you from YouTube, your YouTube channel, American Elitist. But is there any other place that people can find you that you're trying to direct them to?
Yes, if you're interested in following a based Zoomer like me, you can find me on Twitter. I go by the same handle, American Elitist, and you can also find my YouTube channel if you find my content somewhat interesting. You can check me out there. It's under the same name.
I'm just going to pull up your thing here just so people can see. We are now looking at, let's go here. This is American Elitist right here. Boom, boom, boom. Follows me there. Don't look at Digital Archipelago over there. You don't gotta pay attention to any other fucking streams that are going on right now. Look at this. The only stream you should be watching right now. All right. So this has been a fantastic talk. I loved once again getting in touch with you. And so everyone check out American Elitist on YouTube and check him out on Twitter X. And I just want to say thank you again for taking the time for sitting down.
That was my pleasure, man. I'd be happy to do it again if you ever want me back on.
Of course. I'll talk to you soon.